Hello and welcome to Module 2, Week 3. This video is going to cover Discussion 5 and Discussion 6 and all of the readings contained within. Remember to read the announcement as I changed the readings a little bit in Discussion 6 and I also changed the readings a little bit for next week. So to start off with, we start with Discussion 5 and Smith Chapter 6. Be sure to look through the other Prezi on Chapter 6 as I cover in much more detail most of the scholars that are covered by Smith in Chapter 6. In this particular video, what I want to focus on specifically is the idea that rhetoric shifts within this particular time period to a focus on the patristic era. So instead of rhetoric being epistemic, how we make sense of the world, how we attempt to put together arguments so that we can have coherent speeches, rhetoric is now how we put together a sermon so that we can convert all the people sitting in front of us. And in this case, what we're starting to see is a huge shift, and we're going to see this shift for a very, very long time, between logic and rhetoric. So hermeneutics become the way that we make sense of the Bible and the way that we're supposed to understand, and predominantly who's been trained in the right way to make sense of the Bible. And in doing that, what we're shifting is hermeneutics become a sub-branch of logic and rhetoric becomes simply delivery. We don't care about anything beyond delivery. How do we convert the masses through proper rhetoric? So this is a heavy focus for Augustine, who does resurrect several of the ancient Greek philosophers, and this will be really important for your actual discussion. Augustine is focusing on semiotics, so very early, how do we come up with language? How do we use language? How do we make sense of language? And then how do we communicate through language? How does the idea that in this particular case, God puts into my head as the preacher get translated into a sermon that I can deliver to people so the masses have the exact same idea as me? So if I say pet, we all have a slightly different idea of what we think about, but according to Augustine in semiotics, I need to be more specific so that when I say pet, you all think of a fuzzy black kitty cat, and that's what's going to make rhetoric most effective within the church, and that's what's going to make the church then most effective. So that's what rhetoric becomes, is a branch of semiotics. Augustine also divides audiences into 4 classes, and each of the 4 can be argued to differently based on who they are and what their level of belief is, and all 4 are heavily influenced by the preachings of Jesus. These 4 audiences are really important when we go to Averroes, because he also divides his argument structure based on audience, especially the class of audience. In this particular section, what we're seeing with the church is that they've changed the idea of logos. So we're not going to completely get rid of the pagan ways. We're just going to modify how we understand them. So logos becomes a way that we understand, or that we're told, the spoken word of God. So instead of logos being logic, logos is now the word of God, which makes it automatically logical, which makes it automatically believable. So this is also then a branch of hermeneutics. How are we trained to make sense of the Bible? What is the right way? And then what is it that we do with that so that we can continue to get the word of God, so we can continue to spread it in the right way to the masses? So in this whole entire section, and we're going to see for the next couple hundred years, rhetoric is not epistemic. Rhetoric is not how we make sense of the world. Rhetoric is not how we make new knowledge. Instead, logos and the word of God is how we make new knowledge. And for the most part, we don't need to make very much because God has told us. The second reading that you read for this section is Averroes, and this is an Islamic piece, obviously, and what we're seeing here are a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences between Augustinian rhetoric, which is the predominant rhetoric discussed in Chapter 6, and what's going on in the Middle East and Africa at the time period. So logos and truth were heavily focused on by Averroes, and where logos comes from and where truth comes from, and then how they're communicated, are both similar and very different from what we're seeing in the Middle Ages in Europe. Averroes focuses very heavily on language and argument, and the style of language and the style of argument based on the class of the audience that you're then speaking to. And there is a clear division in Islamic rhetoric between faith and reason. Reason is not always presumed to be a part of faith the way that it is for logos and the switching of logos that we see in the Dark Ages across Europe. So make sure to really look at the similarities and the differences between the way that the church is using the Greek rhetors and then the way that Averroes is using the Greek rhetors to put together their idea of how do we convince people, and predominantly how do we convert people people because our religion is the truth. That's what you'll focus on in discussion 5. The final reading for this section is Lou and Horner, and they're discussing this idea of translingual. So translingual is a really, really important idea, and it's still a framework that we use today, and it's still, and obviously this article is not very old, it's still a framework that is heavily influential today because there's still the idea that if or when a student makes a grammar error in a paper, it's because they don't know grammar. It's because they're missing something in their background education. They didn't learn that comma rule. So what most of us end up asking ourselves is how many rules of grammar could we actually write out, and how many of them do we know because it sounds right? So this is where translingualism comes in and is trying to influence especially how we look at pedagogy, especially composition pedagogy. So if we see translingualism as a framework for writing, writer identity, language forms used, and the writer competence as an emergent practice, which means it's always being constructed in every situation that I sit down to write in, I'm constantly framing how I'm going to write, and I'm framing my own identity, and I'm considering what language I'm going to use, and then I'm going to figure out how competent do I feel writing this particular piece. A lot of this is subconscious for most of us, but for second language learners, third language learners, etc., this is a slightly more conscious process. So translingualism says, what if we focus more on how we're constructing the writing situation when we're actually writing, and how much more helpful a conscious effort there can be to writing, and then to agency over writing. So how I feel about my writing, how empowered I feel by writing, and how empowered I feel to write for that particular situation. So if I'm going to go and write for the sciences, I need to feel like a biologist at the moment that I sit down to write that biology article. So how can I mix and match all of these ideas in order to do that? So that's what Lou and Horner are really playing with in this particular article, is how do we understand this? And the big push, especially right now in composition curriculum, and this is across the nation, is how do we make other units who care about writing in their discipline, but not the way that we care about writing, how do we make them aware that when they say there's a grammar issue, it's not grammar, it's style and agency. So similar to what Lou and Horner are saying in this particular piece, how do we get all of the other units, and how do we get students to understand, if you sit down and you consider the situation and you put together some ideas of what the writing context should be, you can recontextualize your writing every time you write at a more conscious level, which is going to make your writing better. So there are obviously some assumptions about power floating in here, and for the units, the way that they write, so the way the biologist writes, and I don't want this to be a critique on biologists by any means, but the way that biologists write for biology is always right, and everybody else just needs to figure it out, and everybody else needs to come to that particular situation. So it's the coming to that the translingual framework is attempting to address. How do we actually mix and match these two ideas, and how do we get people to that part? So you're going to use the framework as an actual application in addressing the two previous readings from this particular module in discussion 5. Discussion 6, and again, I changed some of the readings here, so make sure you read all the announcements, focuses on Smith chapter 7 as well as Erasmus specifically. So Smith chapter 7, look through the other Prezi because again, I have a whole lot more notes and they're a lot more detailed so that you can get all of the different theorists that are in there. The big thing that I want to point out right here is the printing press, obviously. The printing press revolutionized communication, and it forced a shift in literacy and literacy values. We shift over to what is it that we think is meaningful now, and we're starting to assume or believe that the written word is more powerful than the spoken. So prior to the printing press, a lot of people were not literate. They could not read and write because they had no need to. The priest was in charge of their education, and if they were able to be educated, they were typically sent to different types of seminaries, and the lay people didn't have the need for reading and writing because it was too expensive to copy. So why would we teach somebody to read and write if we don't even have access to texts? The printing press changed that. Now we can have access to texts, and we can have access to everything that we want, so we can start to circulate all of these things. The other thing that it changed is circulation. Prior to the creation of the printing press, circulation of text was very, very difficult. Now we can circulate because we can print at a much faster rate and we can have larger copies and it's much cheaper. So now everyday average people can afford it. And what we see with the printing press is the number one most printed book in the world, last time I checked, was the Bible. And I think that's followed at this point a close second by the Quran and Harry Potter. So the printing press is really changing who has access to these new ideas and what happens when they have access to them. So what we see specifically with Martin Luther, and obviously I'm jumping down in the slide, is Martin Luther accidentally created a new religion. It was not his intention to actually break away from the Catholic Church, but every time he nailed his theses up, they would get copied, the printing press would then circulate them. So 6-9 months down the road, and we saw Smith talk specifically about this, a little village would read his theses and they would go all up in arms because they're like, yes, Martin Luther is right. He understands what we're saying. And Martin Luther would throw a big fit and he'd say, that was 6 or 9 months ago. What are you guys doing? I never told you to revolt. I want the church to change their ideas. So there was a disconnect, and I don't think this is Luther's fault. I think this is the newness of the printing press. There was a disconnect between how we're communicating, who we're communicating to, and then what happens to that communication because now it can circulate. So the big shift that we're seeing in chapter 7 specifically is this focus on vernacular language. So instead of using Latin that very few people know and understand, what happens when we switch to vernacular language and we start speaking to people, we can convert more people, but we're also using their language, which means it's something that they already understand. Now they're thinking about ideas. So now we see rhetorical theory development happening again because we need to figure out what happens when people start thinking, because it can obviously be a very scary thing. So we see a disconnect between logic and rhetoric, and this is the disconnect that's going to continue through modernism, where rhetoric in this particular case becomes a part of logic. It becomes the delivery method to convince other people and to share with other people and to communicate with other people the logical path of our thoughts. So I did this science experiment. Here was step 1, 2, and 3. The logic should by itself argue. It should be persuasive, but then my delivery can shift it a little bit depending on who the audience is that's watching it. So logic is now setting aside from rhetoric. Rhetoric is just delivery. So the big speakers, or the big rhetoricians that we saw in this particular section were Erasmus, who we're going to talk about in the next slide, Machiavelli, and Martin Luther. So I've talked about Martin Luther. The other big one is Machiavelli, and Machiavelli really picked up on Cicero's ideas. So what we see with Machiavelli is he brings back all of these ideas that were attached to ethos. So if we have a persona, what happens with our virtues and our vices, and how do we turn our vices into virtues, and what happens on that particular continuum? How do we convince people to take us seriously in very specific ways based on that particular continuum, and then how do we work within that particular framework? So Machiavelli's goal was to bring rest and peace to an area. He basically wanted to be a kept man. So you pay me, you provide all of my meals, and I will philosophize for you. That was his ultimate goal in life. And so what we do know him most for is The Prince, where he says the ends justify the means. But his rhetorical theory is much more complex than that, because he does have a very huge portion of his rhetoric devoted to the people. If you don't keep your people happy, they're going to revolt. And he's like, look at history. We see this over and over and over and over. The Catholic Church is losing significant amounts of power because they've stopped focusing on the people, on the masses. So here's the theory that you can use to instead focus back on the masses, keep them happy while still using, all of these ancient Greek principles for putting together arguments and convincing the people that you're right in all of these ideas. So Machiavelli has a very, very complex rereading specifically of Aristotle and Cicero to convince rulers, here's what you need to do to keep your people happy. Erasmus, which is the second piece that we read, put together the dialogue. So you're obviously reading a dialogue there, so it should have been a little easier to read. And what he's really dealing with in this is, obviously he's read Plato and he's been influenced by Plato because this looks like a Socratic dialogue, but he's also very heavily influenced by both the Sophists and Aristotle. So he's really dealing with the idea, and this dialogue is dealing with the idea of what is the purpose of education. It's clear that we have a female and a male who are in this particular conversation, so so female education is a part of it, but what he's also showing is what happens when a male is not educated. What happens to his arguments? I mean, some of his arguments should have seemed really flimsy and funny, essentially, to us because he was not educated. He was arguing for the reason to not be educated. And ultimately, the reason for not being educated is girls just want to have fun, which kind of made me laugh. And then I was singing that song all night. The other questions that are really heavily raised in these two dialogues is who should be educated and why. And I really want you guys to think about this why question, because this is what the women in the dialogues are really dealing with. There is a very specific function and a purpose for them being educated, and a lot of it has to do with them then educating their own children. If I can educate my children to the point that they're ready for tutors, then my children are going to be even better in the political. It's better for my name and my husband's name, and it's better for our position in society if all of this happens. That's not the only reason women felt they should be educated, but it was definitely a big push that's kind of underlying a lot of this, is that there's a service function to this education. There's a service that these women provide to their husbands. If they remain educated, they can run the house, they can run the house accounts. They can also educate their children so that the husband doesn't have to worry about all of that, and he can go be the big leader in society, and he can be the civic man. So again, we're seeing the sophists, we're seeing Aristotle, we're seeing Cicero being brought back, and in this case specific to education and the ties between education and civic life. So at one point, the female in the first dialogue is called sophistress, very heavily, focused on the sophists and the bad side of education from the sophists. But what Erasmus is really dealing with is what is the place of Greek scholars in education. And this particular dialogue is really important because this was going to be reused by the suffragettes when they're fighting for the right for women to vote. Here's why women need to be educated. And it's going to look very similar to this Erasmus. If you guys have any questions about the readings, feel free to send me an email, or you can always send me a tweet. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the discussion boards.